Hi everyone. So this is a session in relation to completing a fraud risk assessment. Now, a fraud risk assessment provides a central document to capture your organisation or your project's risks. Now, this should be completed with the input from all areas or specialisms working in your project or your organisation, i.e. your policyholders, legal department, finance, HR, whoever's working on the project or in the organisation who are in, I suppose, key areas should be involved in this process. One of the best ways to complete a fraud risk assessment is to get the people from the relevant areas of specialism together and then get them to do a brainstorming session on how they would defraud the scheme or your organization or the project, whatever the item is that you're working on. And basically, we say think like a fraudster. It's really interesting. People can work with each other. You kind of vibe off of each other by looking and hearing different things that people say, and then that generates a lot of ideas. And then all of those ideas can then go into the actual fraud risk assessment template. And you would put those in your identified risks. I think when you're also completing this, it's really important to consider the current fraud landscape, including the impact of COVID-19, and also acknowledging that it's usually individuals that commit fraud. It's rarely organizations. Because some of the questions that might come up might be around, well, why would that organization do that particular thing, or that organization wouldn't do this? But the reality is that people within organizations possibly could and would and do commit fraud. And I think that's the tack to take when considering that. Literally always be looking at things from more of that perspective than an organizational perspective in relation to who may commit the actual fraud. Now, when you're completing the actual fraud risks, what you need to do is identify your actor, your action, and your outcome. Now, your actor is the person who's actually committing the fraud, and that may be a single individual, as we've established, or it might be an organization. You also got the action, which is what they're actually doing. What is that fraudulent action they have undertaken or could potentially undertake in relation to your scheme, organization, or project? And the outcome. What's the result or the impact or even the consequences to you as an organization? That could be financial, it could be reputational, even environmental harm. You need to look at all of these different areas, more like your PESTLE analysis, and just have a look at what the impact could be. Once you've identified those and written them down, the next step would be to look at your controls. Now, the key thing here is to identify and describe the controls, which will help mitigate the risk that you've identified, explain how the controls mitigate that risk, and also describe any limitations and weaknesses in relation to these mitigations. It's really important that these are all mentioned because the person looking at it will get an overarching view of what's going on in those particular areas. Now, when you're identifying the nature of each control, this is broken down into a number of areas. So you have directive controls, like your guidance or your policies. You have deterrents, which are designed to put people off from committing fraud. So again, that can be stuff like segregated duties. It can also be your policies. So anything that you have around deterrence, that would then be listed under this area. You have your preventative controls. And these could be things that would fall under your due diligence, your processes, i.e. Conducting Companies House or charity commission checks and the information that comes back from that and the processes that you have around that. So basically your due diligence. Then you have your detective control and you have your corrective controls. And your detective controls will be looking at information in relation to, but not limited to, things like error after payment. If you're sending out payments, it could cover that area. Also, your corrective area would be around having provisions or legalities in place with regards to post-payment corrections, i.e. clawbacks. So what controls do you have in place around these specific areas? Now, it is really important that you describe each control and state what it actually does to mitigate the risk and how it operates. Don't just name the control, i.e. the system, but stipulate what the system does, how it does what it does, and what the limitations are of that system. These are really key things. that need to be considered, but also need to be clearly noted and written down so that anybody reading the document can establish what's going on in relation to the controls that project or the organization has in place, and if any improvements are required, or if things just need to stay the same, you might need improvements. There might be items where you could think differently. So there's a lot of areas there to be considered. If we move on now to the residual risks. Now your residual risk is the remaining risk after the controls have been applied, because not all controls will completely mitigate the risk that you have found, and it's fine. It's more about you acknowledging that and noting it down. So again, whoever is signing off the document is aware of that. Now, when you're writing the description around this area, suggested wording is, but you don't have to use a specific wording, is the risk can still occur because, for example, with controls in place, it is not possible to stop this risk. This gives the reader a clear idea of what's going on. I would say to go into a bit more further depth if you need to, depending on what the risk is, and just making sure that a clear picture is presented. So when you're looking at this document in its entirety, you can clearly see what's going on from start to finish. If we move on to the scoring matrix, this includes the likelihood and the impact scoring, and when they're combined, they provide the total risk scoring. Now, it is really important to be realistic when it comes to scoring and not optimistic. There are a lot of people who err on the side of caution when completing risk scoring and go or gear more towards the lower numbers. I personally do not think this is useful and it's not helpful. It is really important that a risk is scored correctly, and making sure that if it is a high risk, score it as a 5. It's fine. It's giving the signing officer the full situation in relation to that risk and letting them know what the impact is around it so they can make more informed decisions. So it's just making sure that any scoring that you provide is incorporating these relevant elements. Now, once that's all done, what you would do is you will then provide this document up to your signing officer, and they will make a decision. And by the way that you have scored each of your risks, it will highlight the biggest risks to them and obviously show them which risks are of less concern, but are still important. And then what they will do from there is it gives them the opportunity to decide if they're going to treat, tolerate, transfer, or terminate the risk. So the entire document is dependent on the correct information, I suppose, captured within it. So just to go over some of the key points, ensure that you have your actor, action, and outcome. When you're completing your fraud risks, identify who they are, what they are, and what the outcomes are, including your reputational risks, financial risks, etc., and make sure that they're very clear. When you're looking at your controls, make sure that you're identifying and describing those controls and putting the limitations in relation to what they can and cannot mitigate, and any weaknesses they have. Very important to highlight those, make sure that they're clear, and also making sure that you've got your deterrent controls, preventative, detective, corrective, and directive controls. And breaking them down under these different areas really is helpful because it will highlight to you areas that maybe you haven't considered, or areas where there might be gaps and you might need to do a bit more work around that. And as we've already said about the scoring, very key, highlights the top risks while informing senior management and the signing off officer about the full breadth of the scheme and what they need to be looking at and the impacts on the decision-making process. Thank you very much for your time. Take care now.